Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to the lecture today. Just to say that the format of the lecture is our speaker will speak. It's tradition not to take questions immediately after the talk, but we will have a vote of thanks from Professor Julia Kahan. And then there's an opportunity to ask questions in the foyer outside at the reception, so do take that opportunity to pick up points of interest from the lecture and ask questions. The Davis Memorial Lecture was founded in 1908, over 100 years ago, in memory of Miss Therese Davis, who was the head resident lecturer in classics here at the college. And previous speakers in this series have included Marina Warner, Andrew Wallace-Hadrill, Germaine Greer, Edith Hall, and most recently, Apostolos Doxiadis. Our speaker tonight is Robin Lane Fox, and Robin, we're delighted that you're here and made it through the traffic on the M25. He's a fellow and tutor in ancient history at New College, Oxford, and a university reader in ancient history. His books and articles include major works on Alexander the Great and the relation between the pagan and early Christian religions of the Roman Empire. He's also taught Latin and Greek literature and early Islamic history. He was historical advisor for the film Alexander and is gardening correspondent, I understand, for the Financial Times. Tonight, Robin will talk on Pericles, the most famous political figure in classical Greek history. Pericles' funeral speech has been admired, the admired model for the democratic societies throughout the world. But the question is, how does it seem nowadays in an era when war, imperialism and feminism has given it a new resonance? The lecture aims to reinstate Pericles' claim to greatness by giving a bold interpretation of his life and his political vision. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our speaker tonight, Robin Lane Fox.
If I speak at this level, can you hear me miles away at the back? Anyway, I'm so sorry to have been late, but to a stranger, this is a bit like Alice in Wonderland, even with a map. And also, what a pleasure and honour it is to be invited to speak here. We in Oxford think of Royal Holloway College as really perhaps our closest classics department throughout the United Kingdom, really Europe. So many of the distinguished professors and teachers have either taught themselves in Oxford or been taught in Oxford, and it is the department whose work we watch most closely as it relates so closely to our interests. I expect to speak... I should have brought you. I expect to speak for about 55 minutes, and in your honour, for the first time, I've actually got a text, so we'll see how we go. My title is Why Pericles Matters, and I'm aware that some of you will not know ancient Greek history. Some of you will know it in even more detail than I do. I'm trying to please two constituencies. On an early winter day in 431 BC, the male Athenian citizens, women, metics, and foreigners prepared to listen to the traditional funeral speech for their war dead, the first in their war with Sparta and her allies. 3 days before, the bones of the fallen had been set in a tent for visitors to pay their respects. Then 10 coffins of cedar wood, one for each tribe of the Athenian citizenry, had been loaded with their respective bones and escorted on wagons to the finest suburb of the city, where the public sepulchre stood. An 11th coffin was brought empty, in honour of those Athenians whose bodies had not been recovered. The bones were set inside the sepulchre, and then a speaker, pre-elected for intelligence and public standing, walked up to address the crowd. In 431, he was the preeminent political orator and military commander aristocratic Pericles, son of Xanthippus. My first slide, please. Known for wearing his war helmet, visible above, in everyday life, Pericles, surely helmeted, by now a man in his mid-60s, mounted a platform and surveyed his audience. Pericles was already known for funeral speeches, above all for his speech over Athenian dead in their war with Samos 8 years earlier. But his repertoire was not exhausted. He delivered a speech which was to become the most famous of all speeches, the most imitated speech until our modern age. In 14th century Florence, it shaped funerary eulogies for distinguished members of the Florentine upper class. In 1863, it was a model for Abraham Lincoln and his celebrated Gettysburg Address. In 1915, in wartime, extracts in translation were displayed for patriotic reasons on the sides of London's buses. Only the speech of Pope Urban to announce the First Crusade, Clermont, in November 1095, or the two speeches of our Queen Elizabeth I, one at Tilbury on the eve of the Spanish Armada's arrival, the other her golden speech to her Parliament at the age of 67, are even within reach of the funeral speech's preeminent fame. It differs, however, from them for reasons of cardinal significance. Elizabeth spoke as a queen, and therefore spoke repeatedly of her resolution, her commitment to her subjects. Pericles, by contrast, spoke to an audience dominated by his male fellow citizens, his democratic equals, in the one and only functioning direct democracy the world has so far known. He said nothing, therefore, on his own attitude to combat or his commitment. It was of no special significance. Unlike Pope Urban, he said nothing either about the gods, nor even about a life after death, either as a reward for the fallen or as a comfort, perhaps, for their survivors. Unlike the Pope, he said nothing about killing in battle as the direct route to paradise. For these two reasons alone, Pericles and his speech will always matter. A genial contemporary, Ion of Chios, had met Pericles previously and published his impressions in his travel memoirs. He found him, he wrote, arrogant, hard to approach, and conceited. For Hegel, centuries later, even this loftiness was a marvel. Pericles was, I quote, the Zeus of the human pantheon of Athens. Modern scholarship has tended more in Ion's direction. Recently, Pericles' speech has been described as collectivist, the expression even of, I quote, totalitarian philosophy, nationalist, militarist, excruciatingly imperialist. Even for the great German scholar Hermann Strasberger, the funeral speech, I quote, has something eerie about it, precisely because it is not composed to suit its purpose. Instead of the phrases of Pan-Hellenic neighborly love, which are otherwise on the lips of Athenian orators, Pericles dwells on the real driving force of Athenian energy, the intoxicating satisfaction in one's own power, the capability and intellectual independence of one's own people. But to the rest of the world, hardness, arrogance, contempt, a magnificent hostility. In short, the competitive ideal, Strasberger suggests, of early Greece, thereby proving unintentionally his historian Thucydides' contention that human nature does not change. Since Strasberger wrote, that eeriness has been endorsed by historians with a post-imperial, anti-colonial viewpoint, or attacked by the postmodern impulse to deconstruct or tweak rhetorical assertions as if to relativize their speaker's point of view. Is that only why Pericles matters now. First, a word on our knowledge of Pericles' speeches. 4 centuries later, Cicero cautiously refers to written speeches, I quote, which are said to be by Pericles. But then, Quintilian, like me, said he agreed with those who considered them to be fakes. Aristotle quotes one phrase, and in my view, only one, from Pericles' earlier funeral speech of 439, and his knowledge of it need only derive from anecdotes in the gossiping biographical tradition. I do not believe that Pericles ever circulated texts of his orations. So the speeches we have are due solely to the historian Thucydides, his younger Athenian contemporary. In his histories, he includes 3 full speeches ascribed to Pericles and a 4th, in outline, listing Athens' resources at the start of war. Following modern fashion, I will start reaching a crescendo with ways in which these speeches matter, because their speaker is so startlingly different to ourselves. It's not just that they repeatedly cite shame and envy as the potent human sanctions and emotions, more, I think, than we ever would. There are 3 other reasons. The first matters, I admit, perhaps most to me. Pericles is strikingly dismissive of gardens. He tells his Athenians to look on the loss of the farms they have abandoned to the enemy, on his own advice, as if they are just the Greek word kapion, a kapion. The word is not a metaphor, an appendage. It means exactly a little garden, the diminutive form belittling them, and Pericles then qualifies the little garden as merely, I quote, the showy adornment of riches. His advice here would not exactly convince my readers nowadays on the Financial Times if their properties were ever under threat, let alone the wider English nation of avid gardeners. Athenians' priorities were different. More seriously, Pericles is resoundingly imperialist. Alone of all peoples on record, he tells his Athenians, we are regarded by our subjects as worthy to rule them. His most humane modern commentator, A.W. Dom, remarked in 1956 that this argument is, I quote, one, perhaps the only justification of empire, without which it is intolerable. He also added, a man of his own imperial lifetime, that Pericles is to be criticized for saying nothing of, I quote, the sense of duty or of responsibility which imperialism should give rise to. But what Greek ever did? And as for worthiness to rule, did the people of, say, rebellious Thassos, all of them, really consider the Athenians were worthy? And how did Pericles know? But the point is, ideals matter, even if we can easily subvert them, playing games from other evidence. Above all, near the end of the speech, Pericles devotes a word, if I must, he says, to my translation, excellence in women such as a widow's. Try, he tells them, not to be worse than your existing nature. Do not become an object of praise or of blame among men. He is not referring simply to women's capacity for emotional lamentation at funerals, specifically exercised at this funeral of the war dead. Nor is he saying what the distinguished epigrapher in Athens, Stephen Tracy, has recently made him say, live up to your existing nature. No, he is speaking generally, and he is saying that although women by nature are second class, Professor Hall, at least they must try to avoid a third. They are not to behave like, say, the widow of the Athenian Ischomachus some 20 years later. When rid of her husband, she promptly made off with her son-in-law, ejecting her own daughter, we are told, and caused a public scandal. That is not what Pericles hopes. Yet nobody I can find in the 19th century ever called Pericles sexist, and still many, many in the 20th, or even in 2011, try to dodge the scope of the remark. Historical questions change as the world changes around historians. One major reason why so-called ancient history is always fresh and new. Admiration or criticism, these receptions for the speech go back into antiquity. In 431, the year of it, the Athenians had already enjoyed praises of their city. In April, they had heard them, brief ones, in the superb tragedy by Euripides, the Medea. We can even, I believe, next slide, see a sculpted funerary monument. Is it going to come up? Where's it gone? Slide number 2. Okay. The Albani relief of one of the Athenian war dead over whom Pericles had spoken. It shows an Athenian cavalryman dismounting, yet with his gaze fixed on the gaze returned to his eyes by the fallen enemy. And in the background, hard to see here, is the sculpted outline of hilly landscape, surely the site in Attica where the first Attic cavalry skirmish of the war had occurred this very year, 431. The fixed gaze, the frozen moment in a wider pattern of action, the billowing robe, the form of the bodies, and above all, the horse and its pose, are the hallmarks of a sculptor who had trained under the master Phidias on the great Parthenon frieze, completed some 6 years before. This funerary monument is the classical pair to Pericles' speech. Yet, some 50 years later, the philosopher Plato reacted with feline disgust. His enigmatic Menexenus is the dialogue in which he makes Socrates recall the very words of a funeral speech taught to him not by Pericles, but only the day before by Pericles' celebrated mistress or female partner, Aspasia. Next slide, please. Let's see Aspasia. My next slide. There we are, modern representations of Aspasia. The great man's companion for at least 12 years after his divorce. She had almost flogged the speech into me, Socrates says. She improvised it, some of it, he tells us, and other bits, he says, she had prepared previously when, in Socrates' opinion, she was composing the funeral speech which Pericles actually delivered. She had pasted together leftovers from the speech, Plato tells us, using the very Greek word synkolein. Now, no woman, least of all a foreigner like Aspasia, could ever have given an Athenian funeral speech in public. Irony and malice are heavily in evidence here, combined with impossible chronology, and then a preposterous funeral speech in which Aspasia expatiates on anything from Mother Attica to gloriously muddled thinking about the Athenian constitution, and a highly tendentious version of Athenian history during the past 70 years. Oh, Socrates, Plato's Menexenus concludes, from what you say, Aspasia is blessed indeed, if she is capable of putting such words together, woman though she is. Plato was born a year after Pericles' death. Already, 5th century comic poets, Athens' answer to our private eye, had already claimed, in fun, that Aspasia really wrote the great man's speeches for him, as if, say, Cherie Blair wrote Tony's notorious later speeches for the Labour Party conference. Plato is taking their joke further. He never heard such a speech by Pericles, and although the anecdotal tradition kept one little quote of the 4391 alive, the funeral speech for Plato and his public is surely the one of 431, the only one to survive in a full version. Now, Plato's Aspasia does not speak in the exact style of the famous speech, nor even echo much of it, although quite a few echoes have been claimed by zealous scholars since 1882. However, she does call Athens' democracy an aristocracy, surely Plato's wicked play on Thucydides' view that the democracy was actually becoming one to Thucydides' relief under Pericles himself. But there's a very good reason why she does not echo the speech more. Plato clearly presents her to us as improvising, for the speech he quotes, and as using Periclean rejects, as if she's rummaged with her Pritt through the waste paper basket and found bits unused by Pericles which we've never heard before. So they include un-Periclean praises of the gods, lengthy past history, absurd praises of the Athenian people, who, she says, are too fond of mercy. They all satirize, by implication, the other bits by Aspasia, the bits we had hitherto considered to be Pericles' own. Why did Plato decide to add this amazing parody to his other attacks on Pericles' political demagogic record? The reason is surely that Plato had encountered this great speech, the one, exactly where we do nowadays, in the histories of Thucydides, which have been publicly available since the early 390s. The Menexenus is our earliest evidence for the reception of any of Thucydides' great work, what he himself calls a possession for all time. It is extremely sly and cruel. We have to deal with the question. If Thucydides is the only source of the Periclean speech, is it more Thucydidean than Periclean? I do not accept, experts, the recent argument of Professor Bosworth in 2000 that the speech's historicity is vindicated by an aspect of its general tone, already remarked as odd, incidentally, by Strasburger. For Bosworth, the oddness is Pericles' failure to dwell on any actual feats of the dead in question. And for Bosworth, this unusual, I quote, angle is explained precisely and only by the circumstances of the year 431. As the dead then, the dead, he believes, only in Attica itself, were really not at all significant. Now, indeed, Thucydides tells us that speech honoured the first who died in the war, but contrary to Bosworth's entire theory, he means, of course, all those who died in the entire first year of the war. Hence, the speech was delivered only in early winter, at the end of the military season. And the first year's dead included plenty of Athenians who had died on successful campaigning, on Aegina, on big naval expedition, or ravaging Corinthian possessions. Pericles did not evade discussing the dead's battle record because in 431, for once, they had achieved so little. Rather, at the start of the war, he, I'll defend that, preferred to contrast Athenian values and lifestyle with the Spartans and others. Athens, he wants to show magnificently, is worth dying for. Grounds for accepting the speech's historicity lie nearer home. First, in the sentence which is the most discussed, and, for me, I fear, still the most mistranslated in Thucydides' history. In his remarkable preliminary statement of method, Thucydides begins by telling us, on the one hand, men, it was difficult, even for me or for my informants from elsewhere, to remember through and through, compound verb, the exact nature, the akribeia in Greek, of what was said. Akribeia, hitting the akron as if absolutely on the head, a demanding word for accuracy and never used by Thucydides' predecessor Herodotus. On the one hand, I could not be word perfect, he is saying. But, and in a proud statement of method, we would expect him to go on, I have kept very close indeed nonetheless. And that, on my lone translation, is exactly what Thucydides says. Thucydides goes on to tell us two things. He has selected the speeches which seem to him most pertinent, tadionta, in each circumstance, and he has then stayed as close to their actual words and total argument, some parsimony, I know, as he possibly can. The implication after the first mentors is that usually he has stayed, he believes, very close indeed. In winter 431, in his native Athens, it was particularly easy for Thucydides to keep as close as possible to Pericles' speech. In my view, he was there himself, the young admirer, now in his late 20s, seated, I have come to believe, about 4 rows back from the platform, gazing up in wonder at his political hero, a man of his own high social class. Thucydides was of the military age and the social standing to serve in the cavalry, the very force which Pericles had enlarged so greatly, and even backed up, we now know, with his new war horse scheme, a scheme to ensure the value of each Athenian cavalryman's horse if lost in battle for the city. Thucydides, I believed, had served that very summer with some of the dead who were praised in the speech, including the very Athenian seen in our sculpted relief. I even suspect that, like admittedly later young heroes of fine speakers in antiquity, he had brought bits of papyrus writing paper and a pen to hand. There's a second hint of historicity, at least to my sensitive ear. I believe Pericles can be heard answering critics at the very moment when he spoke. We are lovers of beauty, he says so memorably, with due economy, utilaire. We are lovers of wisdom without softness. Economy, softness, the qualities here are unexpected pairs, but they are intelligible if, as elsewhere, Pericles' intention was to answer critics, voiced in the late 430s, long before Thucydides might have sat down and written the speech up from memory. We are lovers of beauty, yes, he says, but we're not extravagant ones, as the critics say, and as we might say too, after calculating the costs of Athens' new buildings from surviving fragments of the accounts. We are lovers of wisdom, yes, but we're not softies, as critics, maybe the Spartans, are alleging, and as we nowadays might wonder when we read of the highly charged homoerotic atmosphere at an evening symposium party with Socrates. What we read then does really keep as close as possible, very close, in contrast to word perfect, to the total argument of Pericles. Pericles, of course, in a special presentation. Unlike all other speakers in Thucydides' histories, Pericles is never answered. The reason is that the historian looks back in veneration at the great man. Recent postmodern attempts to claim that Pericles' sentiments in the speech are not wholly admired by Thucydides and are given only to be undercut in the books which follow are misguided. Rather, in the first winter of the war, Pericles sets out what matters, the qualities which make Athens great and worth dying for. It also matters because the rest of the histories will show how the city-state with such ideals was derailed by fortune and by bad leadership, leading to needless defeat. Recently, by the social anthropologist Marshall Salins, Thucydides has been accused of neglecting cultural history and the basic fact that human nature varies with each social group's culture. But the funeral speech is one decisive answer to that charge. Its subject is Athens' distinctive culture, the education of Greece. A word now about things which still matter in Pericles' earlier career. Born about 494, Pericles was a mere boy when Xerxes and the Persian invasions were defeated. He matured politically in the 470s, in years of hollow rhetoric about a pan-Hellenic or united Greek campaign of revenge against the barbarian. He's first attested for us as the backer or angel of Aeschylus' masterpiece, The Persian Women, a play of 472. And I accept the play's tone in part aligns him with that masterly democratic politician Themistocles, rather than with those of his fellow aristocrats, people who still found themselves merely living under the folly of democracy. Deserting them and the aristocratic sympathies of his mother's family, Pericles emerged as the leading democratic orator from the 440s onwards. The master sculptor Phidias was still active, as of course was the supreme dramatist Sophocles, but each with more than 20 years of experience already behind them. They've been joined by Euripides in years in which, we must remember, political philosophy is invented for the first time in the world, in which comedies first became hilariously political, and in which problems of ethics, knowledge, and reality were about to burst on the Athenian young and their enlightened older patrons. And they're the years, of course, of the invention of theoretical maths and those stunning buildings which we still admire on the Acropolis. As contemporaries said, Athenians of this era were fearless innovators. Innovation is no problem. They lived through a paradigm shift, culturally, mentally, politically. We call the years from about 450 to 430 Periclean Athens. This very winter, in beleaguered Athens, an entire exhibition has been devoted to Pericles in the recently built museum just below the Acropolis. However, his was only one voice in a sovereign assembly of thousands of voters. What the exhibition did not explain is what was Periclean about Periclean Athens. From the solid core in the surrounding treacherous biographical tradition, I will pick on various firsts for which Pericles still matters. Let's have those beautiful buildings as well as a picture. We have this picture. On again. Next one. Brilliant. Well, slightly brilliant. I will pick on various firsts for which Pericles still matters, and from them a Periclean thread will emerge. But first, a little curiosity. Pericles is the first person in history ever to be said to have kissed his wife each morning on his way out to work, and again each evening on his return. Much is written nowadays about Greek love, but this claim has a place there too. It was worth observing. Pericles is never linked with any same-sex passion or activity. In the 450s, he is the first politician ever known to have introduced pay for political service, for jury service, and also probably for yearly service on the Athenians' council. This innovation implies a radically new view of a community of citizens, even if, as I believe, these payments grew out of the earlier idea of military men, the granting of an upbringing at the state's expense to orphans whose father soldiers had died in battle. In 451 to naught, Pericles introduced a citizenship law which later Greeks and modern scholars have believed to have been motivated by fears of excessive immigration. I will return to it in a different light. In 449 to 8, he's the first politician known in world history to have called for a summit meeting. Naturally, his Congress decree, an authentic initiative, incidentally, was a flop. But it was not a G20 of a flop. It was a flop as Pericles, no panhellenist by outlook, had, I believe, artfully intended. In the 440s, he is linked so closely with the great rebuilding of the Athenians' ground zero, the Acropolis whose shrines the Persians had simply flattened in 480. While he proposed to finance it by borrowing, I believe, with earlier scholars of the difficult inscribed Athenian accounts, that Pericles also proposed the first ever long-term debt repayment, to be spread over 15 years and to pay off previous loans. Being a Greek repayment plan, the figures, of course, are still contested. I could go on, but I wanted only to stress these items because they are all initiatives which still recur in our own political life. Rebuilding ground zero, immigration, state benefits, summit meetings, scheduled debt repayment. We can't say the same of any political figure in any previous non-Greek monarchy, let alone in the despotic monarchies of Egypt or Babylon. Even after 2,400 years, the Athenians are still so inspiringly close to us. The thread, I think, is a principled thread in Pericles' thinking. Citizenship brings civic responsibilities, but in return it brings the right to benefits, not for the poor as poor, but for those who contribute time and political effort. The benefits were not his personal patronage. For the first time, they were state payments, the reward for being an active citizen. Pericles is the first known politician to have associated closely with leading contemporary intellectuals. He picked up their progressive ideas. He had a new idea of a city-state, what Burckhardt later detected in early Renaissance Italy, and entitled famously, "The State as a Work of Art." But Pericles had been there first. I will now return to why the great funeral speech still matters. But first, I will call on the young Macaulay to set the scene. There is every reason, Macaulay wrote in the 1820s, to believe that in general intelligence, the Athenian populace far surpassed the lower orders of any community that has ever existed. Here Macaulay disagrees profoundly with Plato. I quote, "We enter the Athenians' public space. There's a ring of youths, all leaning forwards, with sparkling eyes and gestures of expectation, as I'm sure they do in Royal Holloway College. Socrates is pitted against the famous atheist of Ionia and has just brought him to a contradiction in terms. Pericles is mounting the stand, then a play by Sophocles, and away, more controversially, to sup with Aspasia." Macaulay concludes, "I know of no modern university which has so excellent a system of education." Let us take a cue from Macaulay. Why does the funeral speech still matter for a modern community, not just for a city-state, but for a university, even for a college as distinguished as Royal Holloway? It is, I suggest, because Pericles is still the ideal type of an ideal university principal. According to the witless Plutarch 5 centuries later, indeed he was. Comparing him with Fabius the Delayer in Rome, he was, I quote, gentle to his colleagues. I very much doubt it. If so, Pericles would have been crushed in less than a week in the Athenians' competitive democratic arena. Here, I note, as others have not, the generals who were sent to lead the Athenians' 2 expeditionary fleets to Corcyra in summer 433, as urged by Pericles. They were highly delicate assignments, likely to be the prequel to an all-out war. We know a little only about 3 generals of the 6 sent, but it is consistent. Notably, one of the 3 with the first force is a man whom Pericles had no grounds whatsoever to love, Lacedaemonius, the son of his old political enemy Cimene. And on the second force's three generals, one is no less than Dracontides, a political enemy of Pericles, who would go on to prosecute him for embezzlement, in my view, 3 years later. The second general is Glaucon, or very Glaucon surely, who had assisted the prosecution of Pericles' associate, Phidias, again for embezzlement, in my view, 4 years earlier. 4 of the year's 10 generals, including Pericles himself, did not go out to war. On the year's board of 10, had they combined with their political friend and obliged at least 3 of Pericles' enemies to take the commands, thereby giving them history's shortest straw. The episode certainly shows that Pericles' colleagues, including bitter enemies, and hints to my eye that in turn he could play a hard game against them. Not gentle then, perforce, but we should attend again to his speech. In it, he praises the Athenians' versatility, relating it to their life in a free city and a constitution in which they can turn themselves to so many things, as indeed they could, whether singing, choral dancing, fighting, debating, gaining a livelihood, and so forth. They do so, Pericles tells us, with graces. That is, they are not brash. And they gain too from their city's festivals and the festivals' competitions, athletic ones we need to remember as well as dramatic. They are shaped by the arts, and in turn they are lovers of beauty and lovers of wisdom. They are not the narrowly focused specialists which lesser principles or colleges, let alone governments, might believe to be the aim of higher education, good for business. They are many-sided and proud of it, unlike those who are set nowadays on single tram lines at an early age in Germany's specialized education system, or hedged in by the departmental myopia of at times a brash modern America. Pericles, I believe, despite Aristophanes' silence, also introduced a new state benefit, as a well-informed later source attests for us, a payment to each citizen to buy a theatre ticket for the city's great festival of drama. He did so because the arts, the dramas, what are now called humanities, enhance people, he realized, and enhance their versatility, whereas nowadays we merely give out payments for polluting winter fuel. Most strikingly, the Athenians, Pericles tells us, are special because they precede action with thought and debate. This is striking. They do not just react on impulse to whatever is the latest item in the Daily Mail. They talk it all out, too, before they, as a whole, vote on it. This long-term thinking can be traced, I believe, in Pericles' foreign policy across nearly 40 years, but I won't trace it. Here I will focus on his citizenship law, in university terms, his admissions policy. In 451 to naught, Pericles had it agreed by law that only sons whose parents were both of Athenian citizen birth should be given Athenian citizenship. Explanations of this law allege a new concern to limit state benefits, a new fear of excess numbers swamping the citizen body. But the crucial question, sometimes obscured, is whether the law was to take effect at once on all existing children from 450 onwards, or only to apply to children born thenceforwards who later matured. I believe the latter. By 450, the year of the law, non-Athenian wives were no longer confined only to a few internationally minded aristocrats, and the Athenians collectively would never have voted for a law which would promptly disenfranchise so many of their families' own sons. It was prospective, not retrospective, and it was occasioned, I believe, by a new plan, newly forming with Pericles and others, the plan to send ever more adult Athenians out to landholdings all over the Athenian Empire. When abroad, whether as temporary landlords or actual residents, they might well marry foreign girls, leaving Athenian daughters at home in citizen families without Athenian prospective husbands in their generation. Very well, they could do it. But if they did so, they would know henceforward their children would not have the prized Athenian citizenship. These new émigré landholders were about to multiply from 449 onwards. So, in 450, the prospective law looked 18 years ahead, to the time when the first new batch of the future sons, including sons of these settlers, would be up for citizenship. Such a law had nothing to do with curbing immigrants or curbing benefit recipients. For that, it needed to be effective at once, not only 18 years ahead. Nor was it to curb that the cunning enfranchisement of the bastard sons fathered by citizens on their foreign slave girls. Such bastards were not legally given Athenian citizenship even before the law. The law is strikingly a long-term, carefully thought law. It exemplifies the very thinking before acting, which the funeral speech applauds. Next, the core of democracy. The Athenian state is a free state, Pericles insists. It is called democracy, and in it nobody, just for social rank, will be preeminent simply, my translation, for factional or cliquey reasons rather than for talent. No Bullingdon Club as a first career move. But nor is poverty, on the other side, a bar to political participation. As for the Athenians, they either judge, at least, or they think affairs over and think them through. Passage not always properly translated. That is, all Athenians decide and judge, and nothing can be rammed from a clique at the top onto those below without general open discussion. Everybody decides at the very least, but some of them also think things over in more detail first. It is the model of good governance, which doesn't change, merely people forget it. It is consistent with the model given to the philosopher Protagoras in Plato's famous dialogue. Protagoras, we know, was a friend of Pericles, an admirer of Pericles' stiff upper lip in adversity. He said so. He was also the man who drew up the law code for the new Athenian colony at Thurii, sent out in the Periclean zenith, the mid to late 440s. Next, the pleasure of helping others, but without calculation. When our 18th century author Lawrence Sterne wrote, I quote, "We do not love men so much for the good they have done as for the good we have done them," he even impressed Tolstoy. In War and Peace, Tolstoy gives this very remark, with a credit to Sterne, to his young Maria Bolkonsky, admittedly when she's defending her family's welcome of that decidedly mixed blessing, the pretty blonde French companion, Mademoiselle Bourienne, who later causes such difficulty. But Sterne's remark is anticipated, perhaps even inspired, by Pericles' speech. We do not make friends, Pericles tells the Athenians, from calculation of our self-interest. Here he is not thinking of foreign alliances, because the wise self-interest of them is exemplified all over Thucydides' histories. He is thinking simply of friendships to individuals, tina, within the Athenian state. It is a fine ideal, the pleasure of helping others, and not, he says, simply for the favours they can do for us. An ideal, once again, for a university principal, taking pride in helping others to realise their talents, not calculating what they can do for him. Think long-term, propose, and try to persuade, but everyone involved is to decide. Those who do not participate in decisions are, I quote, useless, just as those in a university department are indeed useless, who are somehow mysteriously on leave when examiners are needed every summer. Pericles' view is communitarian, speaking up for the collectivity. It is not collectivist with their sinister Stalinist undertones. Famously, Pericles also recognizes the freedom of Athenians in their personal life. Not a freedom, he says, to do anything, because the laws and shame are sanctions on the Athenians' behavior. But within those sanctions, we have a cardinal freedom from intrusion, a freedom enjoyed without attendant scowls or reprehension from fellow Athenians, as long as people play their due political part. This is in no way totalitarian. Like a good department, Athenians will not presume to tell others how to manage every hour of their time, nor how to conduct their personal lives. It is the first known expression of a liberal ideal. The great art historian J.D. Beazley drew a parallel here with the procession and horsemen who are sculpted on Athens' contemporary Parthenon frieze. They show, I quote, a union of common aims and individual freedom in an order which never breaks down, though looking constantly as if it would. A marvellous judgment. Computerized study of the ranks of those sculpted horsemen has now supported Beazley's eye. Last, and by no means least, pay. Pericles was the ideal type of a university principal because his advice was proposed to all staff members, only enacted when discussed, and then voted on by a majority. On top of it all, he took no salary. He cost nothing. No parasite. In spring 1985, I asked a then junior Minister of Education in the Conservative government, now the Chancellor of my Oxford, what, from his experience, I should best teach my pupils about political life. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, he replied at once. She's mad. In 1985, already, doesn't like to be reminded. Unlike Thatcher, Pericles could never be so corrupted. Not only he was above bribery, as Thucydides remarks, he had no absolute power anyway. Just remember, Athens had no prime minister, no parties, no 5-year mandates, nor even a government. It functioned no worse than states that do, arguably better. And instead, like every yearly office holder, as a general, one of 10, Pericles was the object of a Greek principle which we ignore at our peril. External scrutiny, accountability to outsiders for whatever officials have spent during a year of office. But what about those women? In his great tragedy, the Antigone, Sophocles, Pericles' friend, has been taken by the late Victor Ehrenberg of London University to be implying a rebuke of Pericles' outlook. Like Creon, Ehrenberg argued, Pericles regarded his own pronouncements as if they were laws. He regarded his decisions of state as overriding the unwritten laws, including the unwritten law to bury one's unburied brother, even if he had died as a traitor to his native city, Antigone's decision. But Ehrenberg was interestingly wrong. Like Antigone, Pericles would never have considered the despotic Creon's pronouncements to be laws, nomoi, in the teeth of his Theban citizens' manifest disgust and opposition. Like Antigone, Pericles too recognized the force and sanction of unwritten laws, laws, he says, which constrain the Athenians' conduct by giving shame. In previous funeral speeches, even in Plato's parody of one for Aspasia, it was customary to cite the distant mythical past, and in it, as one episode, to cite the Athenians' valiant intervention at Thebes against the tyrannical Creon. Athenian audiences, primed by hearing these speeches, were certainly never on Creon's side. Like them, Pericles, an Athenian, would have acknowledged Antigone's rightful action, but, like the play's chorus, he would have been unsettled, perhaps more so, by the awesome intransigence which made her, a woman, the subject of public discussion and ultimately took others with her to the grave. That same dynamic, the rightfulness of her case, but the awesomeness of her female intransigence, is a central dynamic of Sophocles' play. It is not anti-Periclean, it is a dynamic which Pericles too could accommodate. But what, finally, of the women who actually heard Pericles speak? I cannot answer for 431, but I will assume his advice to them had been much the same in his funeral speech of 439. Then, as we know, thanks to Plutarch's contemporary sources, when Pericles came down from the speaker's platform, the women in the audience, I quote, showered him with flowers and garlands as if he was an athlete. Well, as he had said, they were determined not to be worse than their existing nature. At such moments, the Athenians are both near to us and far from us. But lit by Pericles, their ideas still help us too to be better than our untutored selves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lane Fox, for a presentation that's both erudite and entertaining, and one that I will certainly not try to contend with in my position. I will only say very briefly this. We all know that Sir Edmund Hillary's answer to why Everest matters was because it's there. Students of antiquity don't have that privilege. In a sense, we have to answer the question, why does it matter? Because it's not there. Where Everest stands and stares us in reality and in a sense needs no interpretation, Pericles, as Robin Lane Fox has shown us so ably, does require a great deal of scrutiny and a great deal of thought. And so our question is, why do things that are not there matter? And the simple, obvious answer to that, it seems to me, is simply because being not there We cannot simply look at them, climb them, stare at them, admire their snowy caps, or otherwise. We have to think about them. We have to worry about whether our thoughts are right. There is a distance between what we think may have been out there and whatever thoughts we entertain about it. Aristotle, in the fourth book of the Physics, talks about time and about the before and the after. And he says, where there is no perception of change, of kinesis, of movement, there is no sense of time. There is no recognition of anything as to have happened. Well, once we recognize that something is not there, we are forced into the mode of thought, of contemplation, of reflection. And that, perhaps, is the fundamental relationship between ourselves and the things that are not there. And Robin Lane Fox, thank you. You have shown us very ably, in both erudite and entertaining terms, how we might go about doing that and how we might look at the past, which is not readily there, and perhaps learn from that and try to be better ourselves. So on behalf of Royal Holloway, the Classics Department, the Principal, and everyone here, I'd like to thank you for your wise words. I'll just say it is customary in the Davis lecture that no questions are entertained in the hall, but will you please join us outside in the foyer where if you have any questions to our speaker or if you wish to discuss this further, then please do. Thank you very much all for coming, and thank you again to our speaker.